The first thing anyone in Cedar Hollow noticed about Faye Westbrook was that she never said a word. Not to the storekeeper, not to the preacher's wife, not even to the children who waved at her on the boardwalk. She had been in town 3 weeks, and nobody had heard her voice. Some said she was mute. Some said she thought herself too fine for a dusty cattle town. But Everett Hawthorne, watching her from the open door of his forge, noticed something the others had missed, and it was that small detail that would change both their lives. Faye had come to Cedar Hollow in the spring of 1878, stepping off the stage with one worn trunk and a letter from her aunt, Martha Westbrook, who ran the boarding house at the end of Main Street. She was 23 years old, and what she wanted more than anything in the world was simple: to buy flour, thread, and coffee at Pearson's general store without her hands shaking, to walk to church without feeling every eye in town pressing on her like a weight, to belong somewhere, quietly, without anyone asking questions she could not answer. What stood in her way was her own body. Every time a stranger spoke to her, her throat closed like a fist, words piled up behind her teeth, and died there. And in a town of 400 people, where everybody knew everybody, a silent newcomer was not invisible. She was a mystery, and mysteries got talked about. She looked right through me, Mrs. Cobb told the sewing circle. Didn't even nod. Proud as a peacock, that one. Martha says she's shy, offered the preacher's wife. Mrs. Cobb sniffed. Shy is one thing, rude is another. Faye heard none of this directly, but she felt it the way a person feels weather coming. Conversations dimmed when she entered the store. Women's eyes slid over her and away. She began doing her aunt's errands at dawn, when the streets were empty, and that only made the talk worse. Everett Hawthorne was 31, broad through the shoulders from 12 years of hammer work, and by his own admission, not much of a talker himself. His forge sat across the street from Pearson's, and he saw Faye nearly every morning through the haze of his fire. He saw what the gossips didn't. He saw the way she stood outside the store door for a full minute before going in, breathing slow and deliberate, like a man steadying himself before walking into deep water. He saw her rehearsing, her lips moving faintly, practicing whatever 3 words she would need inside. He saw her come out afterward with her purchases clutched to her chest and her eyes shining wet, and he saw her stop at the corner and press her hand flat against the hitching post until her shoulders came down from around her ears. That wasn't pride, Everett thought. He'd seen pride. Pride didn't tremble. He knew that trembling from somewhere, though it took him a few days to place it. Then one evening it came to him. His younger brother, Dan, after the war, took their father. Dan had gone quiet for near 2 years. People called him simple. He wasn't simple. He was carrying something too heavy to talk around. So Everett did not do what a bolder man might have done. He did not stop Faye on the street, or tip his hat, and force a greeting out of her. Instead, on a Tuesday morning in April, he did something small. Faye came to the store at 6:30, as usual. The door was locked. Pearson was late opening. She stood on the boardwalk in the cold, twisting the strings of her bag, and the panic started to climb in her. Now she would have to come back later, when the store was full of people, full of voices, full of eyes. Bench there's clean, if you want to sit while you wait. The voice came from across the street. She turned. The blacksmith stood in his doorway, not looking at her exactly, looking at the bench beside his forge, where the morning sun fell warm. Then he went back inside without waiting for an answer, and she heard the ring of his hammer start up, steady as a heartbeat. He had not asked her anything. He had not waited for her to speak. He had left the choice entirely in her hands, and turned his back to make it easy. Faye stood frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, she crossed the street and sat down on the bench. The heat from the forge reached her through the open door. The hammer rang. Nobody looked at her. Nobody expected anything from her. For the first time since she had arrived in Cedar Hollow, she felt her breath go all the way to the bottom of her lungs. When Pearson finally unlocked his store, she rose, and before she could stop herself, she looked into the dim glow of the forge. Everett didn't glance up from his work, but as she stepped off the boardwalk, she heard him say, "Easy as anything. Bench is there most mornings." It became a ritual neither of them ever named. She came at dawn. She sat. He worked. Some mornings he'd say one thing, "Rain coming, I'd guess." Or, "That gray mare in there threw a shoe twice this week. Stubbornest animal in Texas." Never a question. Never anything that demanded an answer. Faye never replied, but she stopped rehearsing outside the store door. Her hands stopped shaking on the thread and the coffee. And the town noticed. Every morning, Mrs. Cobb reported, eyes bright, sitting outside the Hawthorne forge like she owns it. Won't speak to a soul, but she'll sit for the blacksmith. Now what do you make of that? What Bonnie Lawson made of it was trouble. Bonnie was the liveryman's daughter, 25, handsome and quick-tongued, and she had been setting her cap at Everett Hawthorne for the better part of 2 years. He had never given her much beyond politeness, but politeness was something, and she had built her hopes on it, the way a town builds on a floodplain, not wisely, but with great commitment. She started finding reasons to visit the forge in the mornings, a hinge that needed mending, her father's brand iron, and every time, she found the silent Westbrook girl sitting on that bench like a cat in a sunbeam. "Doesn't it strike you as strange?" Bonnie asked Everett one morning, sweet as syrup, loud enough for the bench to hear. A grown woman who won't so much as say good morning. "My mother thinks there's something not right about a person who hides that way. Something they're not telling." Everett kept his eyes on the iron. "Reckon everybody's got something they're not telling," he said. "Most just talk louder to cover it." Bonnie's smile held, but something behind it cracked. On the bench, Faye sat very still, her heart hammering, because Bonnie was wrong about her. And also, in one terrible way, she was right. There was something Faye wasn't telling, something that had followed her from Missouri, folded up in the bottom of her trunk, in a letter she could not bring herself to burn. And that Sunday, outside the church, a traveling man in a checked coat stepped off the stage, looked around Cedar Hollow's main street, and asked the driver a question that would have stopped Faye's heart cold had she heard it. "I'm looking for a young woman by the name of Westbrook. You happen to know if one's come through here?" The man in the checked coat took a room at the hotel and gave his name as Mr. Aldous Finch. He said he was in dry goods. He asked a great many questions for a dry goods man. By Monday afternoon, half of Cedar Hollow knew a stranger had been asking after the Westbrook girl, and by Monday evening, the other half knew it too. The story grew with each telling. He was a lawman. He was a debt collector. He was a jilted fiancé come to drag her back to Missouri. Mrs. Cobb favored the theory that Faye had stolen something, which explained the silence. "A guilty conscience," she said, "sits on the tongue like a stone." Faye learned about the stranger from her aunt, who told her gently over supper, watching her face. Martha Westbrook was a wide, warm woman who asked few questions, which was the reason Faye had come to her at all. "He asked at the store about you," Martha said. Pearson told him nothing, because Pearson doesn't know anything. "But honey, he's not leaving. Whatever it is, it'll keep coming till you turn and face it." Faye set down her fork. Her hands had gone cold. That night, she took the letter out of her trunk and sat with it on her lap, without opening it, because she knew every word already. Then she folded it back into its hiding place, and for the first time since Missouri, she cried until the candle burned out. She did not come to the bench Tuesday morning. Everett noticed the way you notice a missing tooth, constantly, with your whole attention. He told himself it was nothing. Rain, maybe, or her aunt needing help. But Wednesday, she didn't come either. And Thursday, The bench sat empty in the sun, and Everett found himself striking crooked blows for the first time in a decade. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's affairs. His brother Dan had taught him that healing hated an audience, but he had also heard, from 3 separate customers, about the stranger in the checked coat, and he had done the arithmetic any fool could do. The man arrived, and the girl vanished. Friday, Mr. Finch himself came to the forge with a horse that didn't need shoeing. "Fine animal," Everett said, running a hand down the leg. "Shoes are near new." "So they are." Finch smiled with a lot of teeth. "Truth is, I hear you're acquainted with a young woman I've been trying to locate. Quiet girl, fair hair. Goes by Westbrook." He drew a coin from his vest and turned it over his knuckles. "There's people back in Missouri who'd pay handsomely to know she's safe and settled. Family concern, you understand." Everett looked at the coin, then at the man. "Can't help you." "Can't or won't. Take your pick." Everett handed back the reins. "No charge for the looking." Finch's smile didn't move, but his eyes did. A quick, cataloging flick around the forge, the bench, the street. "Folks say she sits here of a morning. Folks 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 say she sits here of a morning. Patience is most of my trade." Everett watched him ride toward the hotel, and something old and slow turned over in his chest. Then he took off his apron, banked his fire, and did a thing he had never once done in 12 years. He closed the forge in the middle of a working day. Martha Westbrook answered the boarding house door with flour on her hands and suspicion on her face, and both softened when she saw who it was. "She won't come down," Martha said quietly. "Hasn't hardly left her room since Monday. Won't eat but a little. I don't know what to do for her, Mr. Hawthorne, and that's the honest truth. I don't need her to come down." Everett said, "I'd just ask you to tell her something. Tell her the bench is still there. Tell her—" He stopped, turned his hat in his hands, started again. "Tell her nothing. She's carrying changes where that bench sits. That's all." He was halfway down the steps when he heard the stairs creak inside. He stopped. Through the screen door, in the dim of the hallway, stood Faye. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red-rimmed, and she was looking straight at him, the way she looked at the store door on the hard mornings, like something she had to gather herself to walk through. Her lips parted. Nothing came. He saw her throat work, saw the words pile up and jam, saw the old panic start its climb, and he did what he always did. He took the weight off. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. Never did. But Faye shook her head, shook it hard, like she was refusing the mercy itself. Her hands were fists in her skirt, and then, in a voice rusty as an unused gate, cracked and barely above a whisper, the first words anyone in Cedar Hollow had ever heard her speak, she said, "He's not family concern. He's my husband's man." The words hung in the air between them. Everett went very still. "Your husband," he said. "I had one." Her voice shook, but it kept coming now, like water through a broken dam, quiet and unstoppable. "In Missouri. Mr. Garrett Sloan. Everyone said I was lucky. He had a way of talking that made you feel small enough to fit in his pocket. By the second year, I couldn't order in a shop without looking at him first, to see if I'd said it right. By the third year, I stopped talking at all. It was easier. Silence was the only thing he couldn't twist." She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe, the same way she used to press the hitching post. "He passed last winter, fever, and his brother says the widow's portion is his, says I signed papers I never signed, and when I wouldn't agree to it, he said he'd find me wherever I went, and make people believe whatever he wanted about me. Mr. Finch is his man. He's found me. And when a man like that finds you—" Her voice failed at last. Martha had gone gray in the doorway. Everett stood on the steps in the afternoon sun, and inside him the slow old thing finished turning over and settled into something hard and calm. "The letter," he said. "The papers he says you signed. You have them?" Faye nodded once. "Then he's got a problem," Everett said, "because paper doesn't lie. And I know the circuit judge that comes through Cedar Hollow, and I know every man in this town who'd stand up when asked." He set his hat back on his head. "You've been fighting this alone a long while. You don't have to anymore." For a moment, something like hope crossed her face, and then, over his shoulder, her eyes went wide. Everett turned. At the end of the street, outside the hotel, Mr. Finch stood watching the boarding house. And beside him, just stepped off the afternoon stage, with his coat brushed and his smile already in place, stood a tall man Faye knew better than her own nightmares. Garrett Sloane's brother had not sent his man to find her. He had come himself. His name was Cyrus Sloane, and he came up the street like a man who had never once been told no. He wore a good coat and a better smile, and he tipped his hat to Mrs. Cobb on the boardwalk, and Mrs. Cobb, charmed, tipped her head right back. That was how he worked. Faye knew it the way she knew winter. He would be gracious to the whole town first. He would buy drinks and shake hands, and tell his sad story. Poor bewildered brother-in-law, chasing a troubled widow who'd run off with family papers. And by the time he ever spoke to her directly, Cedar Hollow would already believe him. He had done it in Missouri. The silence people mocked her for had been built brick by brick in rooms where her word weighed nothing. "Miss Faye," he stopped at the boarding house steps, hat over his heart. "You had us worried sick." Faye's throat closed like a fist. The old machinery, the old obedience. She felt herself shrinking to fit a pocket. Then she felt the porch board shift as Everett came back up one step, not in front of her, not shielding her, beside her, and she remembered the bench, and the hammer keeping time like a heartbeat, and a voice saying you don't have to say anything, and understood, all at once, that being allowed silence was the very thing that had given her words back. "You're not welcome here, Mr. Sloane," she said. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Cyrus's smile flickered, just at the edges, like a lamp in a draft, because in 3 years, he had never heard this woman finish a sentence. He recovered fast. He always did. "Grief does strange things," he said, sorrowful, pitching it to the little crowd gathering. Pearson in his apron, Bonnie Lawson and her father, Mrs. Cobb. "My brother's widow took papers that weren't hers to take. I've a signed agreement about the property. I only want what's lawful." "Then you'll love what's coming," Everett said pleasantly. "Circuit judge is due through in 8 days. We'll put your signed agreement next to her letters, and her true signature, and let the law read them side by side. Paper doesn't lie." He paused. "Men do." Something ugly surfaced in Cyrus's face, quick as a fish, and sank again. But the town saw it. Bonnie Lawson saw it, clearest of all. And Bonnie, whatever her faults, had been raised by a horse trader and knew a bad animal when its ears went back. "Funny kind of grieving family," Bonnie said slowly, "that hires a man in a checked coat to go asking questions sideways before ever knocking on the front door." Mrs. Cobb looked at Mr. Finch. Mr. Finch looked at the ground. Cyrus Sloane stayed 6 more days. He bought his drinks and told his story, but the ground had shifted under it. Martha let it be known what she knew. Pearson mentioned the girl had paid honest cash money every week, shy as a deer but straight as a rail. And Everett said almost nothing at all, but he stood outside his forge every morning, while Faye sat on the bench in full view of the whole town, unhidden, unashamed, and the picture told its own story. On the 7th day, one ahead of the judge, Cyrus and Mr. Finch took the morning stage east. The signed agreement was never seen again. Men who forge papers, it turns out, prefer not to hand them to judges. Faye watched the stage shrink into the distance from the bench by the forge. She waited to feel triumphant. Instead, she felt something quieter and better. The feeling of setting down a trunk she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its weight. "He's really gone," she said. Everett set down his hammer and came to the doorway, wiping his hands. "He is." "You never asked me," she said. "In all of it, you never once asked me what happened, or why I couldn't talk, or anything. Everyone always wants the whole story before they'll help you. You helped first." Everett considered that, turning it over the way he turned over iron, looking for the true shape in it. "My brother went quiet after the war," he said. 2 years. People pushed at him like a stuck door. Never worked. One day, I just started sitting with him while I mended tack. Didn't ask anything. Along about the 4th month he started talking, and once he started, he didn't stop for a week. He smiled a little. "I figured a door opens easier when nobody's shoving it." Faye laughed. Actually laughed. A small, rusty, startled sound, and the look on her own face at hearing it made him laugh too. They were married in October, when the cottonwoods along the creek went gold. The whole town came. Mrs. Cobb cried, and claimed she'd always known there was quality in that girl. Nobody contradicted her, because Cedar Hollow had learned something that spring about the cost of deciding what a person is before you know them. Bonnie Lawson stood up with Faye at the wedding, a friendship no one saw coming, built on the day Bonnie chose the truth over what she wanted, and caught the bouquet with both hands, and no apology. Faye Hawthorne never became a chatterbox. On hard days, her words still came slow, and on those days her husband simply worked while she sat near the warmth, and the hammer kept time, patient as ever. But she greeted the storekeeper. She sang in church, quietly, half a beat behind. And years later, the children of Cedar Hollow knew her as the soft-voiced woman at the house by the forge, who never rushed anybody's answer, and never let anyone rush theirs. 3 little Hawthorns, learning it earliest of all, raised on their mother's lap in the doorway of the forge, where the bench still sat in the morning sun, and always would.